The courtroom fell silent as billionaire real estate mogul Richard Thornton III took the stand, his perfectly tailored suit and commanding presence demanding attention from every person in the gallery. His voice trembled with what appeared to be genuine emotion as he recounted the events of that fateful Tuesday afternoon. "I came home early from a business meeting," he began, dabbing at his eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. "What I witnessed will haunt me forever. My daughter Emma, just 7 years old, was cowering in the corner of her bedroom, bruises visible on her arms, while our housemaid stood over her with a raised hand." The accusation hung in the air like a death sentence, and murmurs rippled through the courtroom as spectators turned to look at the defendant. Sitting at the defense table was Grace Washington, a 52-year-old woman who had worked for the Thornton family for nearly 5 years. Her hands were folded calmly in her lap, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. She had maintained her innocence from the moment the police had arrived at the mansion, but the evidence seemed damning. Photographs showed clear bruising on the child, and Richard's testimony was delivered with the conviction of a man who had witnessed something unforgivable. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced woman named Linda Chen, paced before the jury with calculated precision, building her case brick by brick. She presented medical records documenting Emma's injuries, testimony from neighbors who described Grace as sometimes stern with the children she cared for, and most damning of all, the fact that Grace and Emma had been alone in the house when the alleged assault occurred. Grace's public defender, a young attorney named Marcus Freeman fresh out of law school, seemed overwhelmed by the magnitude of the case. This was his first major trial, and he was up against one of the wealthiest men in the city who could afford the best legal representation money could buy. The media had already tried and convicted Grace in the court of public opinion, with headlines screaming about the monster Maid, and debates raging on social media about privilege, race, and justice. Throughout Richard's testimony, Grace remained composed, though those sitting closest to her could see the slight tremor in her shoulders. She had worked countless hours caring for Emma, had tucked her into bed hundreds of nights, had bandaged scraped knees and dried tears after nightmares. The thought that anyone could believe she would harm the child she loved as her own was almost too much to bear. As Richard concluded his testimony with a dramatic plea for justice, the judge called for a brief recess. In that moment, something unexpected happened. Emma Thornton, who had been sitting in the front row next to her mother, suddenly stood up and shouted in a clear, unwavering voice that cut through the dispersing crowd, "Daddy is lying." The courtroom froze, every eye turning toward the small blonde girl in the blue dress who had just contradicted the most powerful man in the room. The courtroom erupted into chaos as Emma's words echoed off the mahogany-paneled walls. Richard Thornton's face drained of color, transforming from the composed expression of a grieving father into something closer to panic. His wife, Veronica, a former model who had long ago traded her career for the role of trophy wife, reached for Emma with trembling hands, but the little girl pulled away with a determination that seemed far beyond her years. Judge Patricia Hamilton, a stern woman with 30 years on the bench, slammed her gavel repeatedly, demanding order in the court. "Silence," she commanded, her voice cutting through the pandemonium like a knife through butter. Security guards moved instinctively toward Emma, but Judge Hamilton raised her hand, stopping them in their tracks. Something in the child's face, a mixture of fear and resolve, gave the judge pause. Marcus Freeman, the young defense attorney, felt his heart racing as he realized this might be the break his case desperately needed. He stood quickly, his voice finding strength it hadn't possessed moments before. "Your Honor, I request permission to have the child testify. Clearly, she has information pertinent to this case." The prosecutor objected immediately, citing Emma's age and the potential trauma of testifying against her father, but Judge Hamilton was already considering the unprecedented situation. The law typically protected children from testifying in such circumstances, but the girl had spoken of her own accord, and there was something compelling about her desperate outburst. After a moment of deliberation that felt like an eternity, the judge made her decision. "I'm going to allow the child to speak in my chambers, with appropriate counselors present. We'll take a 1-hour recess while arrangements are made." Richard Thornton's expensive legal team immediately surrounded him, voices low and urgent as they strategized. His lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Harrison Blackwell who had never lost a case, was visibly concerned. This was not part of their carefully orchestrated plan. Across the aisle, Grace Washington finally allowed herself a moment of hope, though she remained cautious. She had learned through hard experience that hope could be dangerous, especially for someone in her position. She caught Emma's eye across the courtroom, and the little girl gave her the smallest of smiles before being led away by a child psychologist. In that brief connection, Grace saw something she had witnessed countless times during bedtime stories and morning breakfasts, the truth that existed between two people who genuinely cared for each other. The media outside the courthouse exploded with the development. Reporters scrambled to update their live broadcasts, speculation running wild about what the child might reveal. Social media erupted with hot takes and conspiracy theories. The public divided between those who believed Richard Thornton's wealth had corrupted his daughter's testimony and those who suspected the maid had somehow coached the child. Inside the courthouse, in Judge Hamilton's private chambers, preparations were being made for what could be the most crucial testimony of the trial. The room was made as comfortable as possible for a child, with soft lighting and a chair that didn't dwarf Emma's small frame. A child psychologist sat nearby, ready to intervene if needed, while a court reporter prepared to document every word. In the quiet sanctity of Judge Hamilton's chambers, Emma Thornton sat in an oversized leather chair, her legs dangling several inches from the floor. The room smelled of old books and furniture polish, a stark contrast to the sterile formality of the courtroom. Despite her small stature and the enormous pressure of the situation, Emma exhibited a composure that surprised everyone present. Dr. Sarah Chen, the child psychologist, sat close to Emma, her presence meant to be both comforting and protective. The judge had made the decision to keep both attorneys present, along with a court reporter, but had barred the parents from the room to prevent any undue influence. Marcus Freeman noticed his hands were shaking slightly as he prepared his legal pad, understanding that the next hour could determine whether an innocent woman spent decades in prison or walked free. Judge Hamilton began gently, her usually stern demeanor softening as she addressed the child. "Emma, do you understand why we've asked you here today?" The little girl nodded, her blonde curls bouncing slightly. "Because Daddy said Grace hurt me, but that's not what happened." Her voice was small but steady, each word chosen with careful precision that belied her age. The judge leaned forward slightly, encouraging her to continue. "Can you tell us what really happened that day, Emma? Take your time, and remember, you're not in trouble. We just need to know the truth." Emma took a deep breath, her small hands gripping the armrests of the chair as if drawing strength from their solidity. What she said next would shake the foundation of everything Richard Thornton had built, both in court and in life. "Daddy hurt me," Emma said simply, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "He gets really angry sometimes, especially when he's been drinking the brown stuff from the bottles in his office. That day, I spilled juice on some papers on his desk while I was trying to draw him a picture. He got so mad." Tears began to stream down her face, but she continued, her voice never wavering. "He grabbed my arm really hard and shook me. He said I was clumsy and stupid, just like Mommy. Then he threw me against the wall." Grace wasn't even there yet. She was still at the grocery store. Dr. Chen quietly handed Emma a tissue, while the court reporter's fingers flew across her stenography machine, capturing every heartbreaking word. Marcus Freeman felt rage building in his chest, but forced himself to remain professional, to let Emma tell her story without interruption. The little girl continued, painting a picture of a household where appearances mattered more than truth, where a powerful man's image was protected at all costs. "When Grace came home and saw me crying, she helped me. She put ice on my arm and held me. She asked me what happened, and I told her. She said we needed to tell Mommy, that what Daddy did was wrong." Emma's voice grew quieter, more frightened. "But when Daddy came home, he saw the bruises, and Grace asked him why he hurt me. He got really, really angry then. He told Grace that if she said anything to anyone, he would make sure she went to jail. He said nobody would believe a maid over him. Then he called the police and told them that Grace hurt me. He made me stand there and not say anything, and he told me that if I told the truth, they would take Grace away forever, and it would be my fault. The room was heavy with silence after Emma finished speaking. Judge Hamilton's expression had transformed from judicial neutrality to barely suppressed fury. Harrison Blackwell, Richard's attorney, sat frozen, realizing his client had not only committed assault, but had orchestrated an elaborate frame-up. The prosecutor, Linda Chun, looked physically ill, understanding she had been an unwitting participant in a grotesque miscarriage of justice. Emma looked around at the adults, her young face showing fear that she had done something wrong by telling the truth. Dr. Chun put a comforting arm around her shoulders and whispered that she had been very brave. As the implications of the child's testimony settled over everyone present, it became clear that this case had just taken a dramatic and irreversible turn. When court reconvened after the recess, the atmosphere had completely transformed. Judge Hamilton's expression was granite as she took her seat, and those who had practiced before her for years recognized the look of a jurist who had witnessed something that offended her deepest sense of justice. Richard Thornton sat at the plaintiff's table, his confidence from earlier in the day replaced by visible anxiety. His attorneys had clearly briefed him during the break, and he understood that his carefully constructed narrative was about to collapse. Grace Washington, for the first time since the trial began, sat with her shoulders back and her head held high, the weight of false accusation beginning to lift even as she waited for the official vindication she deserved. The gallery was packed with spectators who sensed that something momentous was about to occur, though none of them yet knew the details of what had transpired in chambers. Judge Hamilton addressed the court with controlled fury. "In my 30 years on this bench, I have witnessed many disturbing things, but what I have learned this afternoon ranks among the most egregious perversions of justice I have encountered." She turned her gaze directly to Richard Thornton, and several people later swore they saw him physically shrink under her scrutiny. "Mr. Thornton, based on testimony I have heard from your daughter in chambers, in the presence of counsel for both sides and a qualified child psychologist, I am ordering an immediate investigation into allegations of child abuse and perjury. Furthermore, I am dismissing all charges against Ms. Grace Washington and ordering her immediate release from any bail conditions." The courtroom erupted, but this time the noise was different, a mixture of shock, vindication, and righteous anger. Reporters scrambled to update their outlets, fingers flying across phones and laptops as they rushed to be first with this stunning reversal. The prosecutor, Linda Chun, stood immediately, her professional pride stung by having been manipulated into prosecuting an innocent woman. "Your Honor, the state wishes to formally apologize to Ms. Washington for the injustice she has suffered. We will be cooperating fully with any investigation into Mr. Thornton's actions and will be reviewing our own procedures to ensure we are never again used as instruments of such deception." Her words were professional, but those who knew her could hear the anger beneath them. She had dedicated her career to seeking justice, and discovering she had been a pawn in a rich man's scheme to frame an innocent woman was almost more than she could bear. Marcus Freeman stood as well, his voice stronger than it had been at any point in the trial. "Your Honor, on behalf of my client, we request that the court order Mr. Thornton to cover all legal fees and any damages resulting from this malicious prosecution." Richard Thornton's world was disintegrating in real time. Harrison Blackwell, his attorney, was already distancing himself and his firm from the scandal, knowing that his reputation was on the line. "Your Honor, I wish to inform the court that my firm will be withdrawing from representation of Mr. Thornton effective immediately. We were clearly misled about the facts of this case. It was a calculated move to protect his own career, throwing his client to the wolves to save himself." Security officers were already moving toward Richard, and when Judge Hamilton issued a warrant for his arrest on charges of child abuse, perjury, and filing a false police report, they placed him in handcuffs with an efficiency that suggested they took some satisfaction in the task. The mighty billionaire, who had walked into court that morning expecting to see a woman destroyed, was now being led away to experience firsthand the justice system he had attempted to corrupt. As Richard was escorted from the courtroom, he caught sight of his wife Veronica sitting with Emma. The little girl was holding her mother's hand tightly, and neither of them looked at him as he passed. In his daughter's steady gaze directed away from him, Richard finally understood the full measure of what he had lost. His freedom was gone, his reputation destroyed, but worst of all, he had severed the bond with his own child through his violence and subsequent lies. Grace Washington, watching him being led away, felt no triumph, only a profound sadness that a man with so much had chosen to use his power in such a destructive way. She thought about all the mornings she had made Emma breakfast, all the nights she had read her stories, all the small moments of care that had been genuine love, while the girl's own father had been capable of such cruelty. As the courtroom slowly emptied and Grace finally stood as a free woman, she knew that the real work was just beginning, helping Emma heal from the trauma her father had inflicted. Within hours of the courtroom drama, the story had exploded across every major news outlet in the country. What had begun as a simple assault case had transformed into a national conversation about wealth, power, race, and the ways the justice system could be weaponized by those with resources. Cable news channels ran continuous coverage, with legal experts analyzing every aspect of the case and social commentators discussing its broader implications. Grace Washington found herself at the center of a media firestorm she had never wanted or anticipated. Camera crews camped outside her modest apartment building, reporters shouting questions whenever she appeared, and her phone ringing constantly with interview requests from everyone from local news stations to national morning shows. The attention was overwhelming for a woman who had spent her life working quietly in the background, caring for other people's children while raising her own son as a single mother. The public reaction was swift and largely sympathetic to Grace, though, as with any high-profile case, there were dissenters who questioned various aspects of the story. Social media became a battlefield of opinions, with hashtags like Justice for Grace and Protect the Helpless trending worldwide. Many domestic workers shared their own stories of mistreatment and vulnerability, creating a broader dialogue about the power dynamics in households where wealth creates vast chasms between employers and employees. Civil rights organizations held press conferences calling for reforms to protect domestic workers from false accusations and abuse. One particularly viral post came from a former employee of the Thornton household, a young woman who detailed her own experiences with Richard's temper and controlling behavior, lending additional credibility to Emma's testimony and suggesting a pattern of misconduct that had been hidden behind carefully constructed public relations and non-disclosure agreements. Marcus Freeman, the young public defender who had caught what should have been a routine case, suddenly found himself in the spotlight as well. Legal publications praised his handling of the case, though he was honest in interviews that Emma's courage had been the turning point, not his legal strategy. Still, his career trajectory had changed overnight. Private firms were already reaching out with job offers, and he was being interviewed about his approach to public defense and his commitment to representing clients that others might have written off. He remained focused, however, on ensuring that Grace received every form of justice and compensation available. He filed a civil lawsuit against Richard Thornton for malicious prosecution, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, with damage estimates in the millions. He also began working with state legislators on a bill that would create stronger protections for domestic workers and impose harsher penalties for false accusations. Richard Thornton's business empire began crumbling almost immediately. Corporate partners distanced themselves, his face was removed from charitable foundations he had funded, and his real estate holdings faced boycotts from tenants and potential buyers. His company's board called an emergency meeting to discuss removing him from all positions of authority, with shareholders demanding action to protect the value of their investments. The financial press, which had once celebrated him as a visionary entrepreneur, now dissected his career for warning signs of moral bankruptcy. Investigative journalists dug deeper into his past, uncovering allegations of workplace harassment, intimidation of business rivals, and a pattern of using his wealth and legal resources to silence critics. Former employees came forward with stories that painted a picture of a man who had always believed his money placed him above accountability. In his jail cell awaiting arraignment, Richard finally had time to contemplate how thoroughly his own hubris and violence had destroyed everything he had built. Meanwhile, Veronica Thornton filed for divorce and an emergency restraining order, seeking full custody of Emma. In a statement released through her attorney, she expressed remorse for not recognizing the abuse occurring in her own home and pledged to dedicate herself to Emma's healing and well-being. She also publicly thanked Grace for her years of loving care for Emma and apologized for not protecting her from the false accusations. The statement was careful and clearly lawyer-reviewed, but those who knew Veronica said it represented a genuine transformation. She had lived for years in the shadow of her powerful husband, afraid to question or challenge him, but her daughter's bravery had awakened something in her. As the media storm continued to rage, several things became clear. This case would have lasting implications far beyond the individuals involved. The power of truth could overcome even the most elaborate lies, and sometimes courage came from the most unexpected sources. As detectives from the district attorney's office began their expanded investigation into Richard Thornton's conduct, they uncovered layers of deception that went far beyond the false accusation against Grace Washington. Search warrants executed at the Thornton mansion revealed a home office filled with documents that painted a disturbing picture of a man obsessed with control and willing to destroy anyone who crossed him. Investigators found files on numerous household employees, complete with background checks that delved into personal details far beyond what was necessary for employment purposes. There were notes suggesting Richard had used information about employees' immigration status, criminal records of family members, and financial vulnerabilities to ensure their silence about various incidents over the years. One folder, labeled simply Insurance, contained non-disclosure agreements with settlement amounts that suggested multiple previous accusations that had been quietly resolved with money and legal threats. Detective Maria Rodriguez, a veteran investigator with the district attorney's Special Victims Unit, took the lead on examining the evidence against Richard. She had worked hundreds of cases involving powerful perpetrators who believed their status made them untouchable, but the coldly calculated nature of Richard's frame-up of Grace particularly disturbed her. As she reviewed the timeline of events, she realized Richard had likely planned the accusation even before calling the police. He had photographed Emma's injuries himself, documenting them in a way that would look like evidence collection but was actually stage setting for his false narrative. He had called his attorney before calling 911, discussing strategy before involving law enforcement. Most damning, they found text messages on a phone he believed had been wiped, messages to colleagues joking about handling the help and making problems disappear. Each discovery added weight to the criminal charges he was facing and strengthened the civil case Grace was building. The investigation also revealed troubling information about how Richard had manipulated the initial police response. He had immediately name-dropped connections in the police department and city government, subtly implying that his version of events should be accepted without too much scrutiny. The responding officers, both now being reviewed for their handling of the case, had apparently done minimal investigation beyond taking Richard's statement and arresting Grace. They hadn't properly interviewed Emma alone, hadn't documented inconsistencies in Richard's account, and had failed to notice that the timing of Grace's arrival at the house didn't match Richard's narrative. The police department's Internal Affairs Division opened its own investigation into whether Richard's wealth and influence had resulted in preferential treatment that compromised the integrity of the criminal justice system. It was an uncomfortable reckoning for a department that prided itself on impartial law enforcement but couldn't deny the appearance of a two-tiered system of justice. Meanwhile, Emma was undergoing therapy with Dr. Sarah Chin, the child psychologist who had been present for her chamber testimony. The sessions revealed the extensive psychological damage Richard's abuse had inflicted, not just from the physical violence, but from forcing his daughter to witness him frame an innocent woman. Emma had nightmares about Grace going to prison because she hadn't been brave enough to speak up sooner. She struggled with guilt over the weeks Grace had spent fighting charges while Emma remained silent, even though she was just a child who had been terrorized into compliance by a parent who should have protected her. Dr. Chin worked carefully with Emma, helping her understand that she was a victim, not a perpetrator, and that speaking the truth when she did had been an act of remarkable courage. The therapy reports would become part of the evidence documenting the full extent of harm Richard's actions had caused, affecting not just Grace, but his own daughter in ways that would require years to heal. As the investigation continued to expand, Federal authorities began looking into Richard's business practices. Financial records subpoenaed as part of the criminal case revealed patterns that suggested tax evasion, securities fraud, and money laundering. What had started as a child abuse and perjury case was growing into a comprehensive examination of a man who had apparently believed that wealth exempted him from all rules and consequences. Richard's attorneys were desperately trying to negotiate a plea deal, knowing that taking the case to trial could result in decades in prison across multiple charges. But prosecutors, now fully aware of how close they had come to being tools in the wrongful imprisonment of an innocent woman, were in no mood for leniency. Justice, they made clear, would not be negotiable this time, regardless of wealth or social position. In the weeks following her vindication, Grace Washington struggled with the complex emotions that came with sudden freedom after months of living under the shadow of false accusations. Sleep was difficult. She would wake in the night with panic attacks, her mind replaying the moment police officers had handcuffed her in the Thornton mansion while Emma watched in confused silence. She had nightmares about alternative timelines where Emma hadn't found the courage to speak, where she was convicted and sent to prison for a crime she didn't commit, where she lost everything she had worked her entire life to build. Her sister, Patricia, moved in temporarily to provide support and help manage the overwhelming attention that continued to follow Grace everywhere she went. Patricia had taken emergency leave from her job as a nurse to be there, understanding that her sister needed family in ways she hadn't needed in years, perhaps ever. The psychological toll of the ordeal was something Grace hadn't fully anticipated. She found herself flinching when she saw police officers, even though she knew they were there to protect her from the persistent media presence. She couldn't bring herself to enter homes of wealthy families, even for job interviews for positions that would have paid well. The betrayal by Richard Thornton, a man she had served faithfully for 5 years, had shattered her ability to trust employers from privileged backgrounds. Marcus Freeman connected her with a therapist who specialized in trauma, particularly trauma related to racial injustice and abuse of power. Dr. James Morrison, an elderly Black man who had been practicing psychology for 40 years, understood implicitly the layers of Grace's pain. It wasn't just about the false accusation. It was about a lifetime of navigating spaces where her humanity could be questioned, where her word meant less than that of those she served, where she could be disposable despite her dedication and dignity. Financially, the aftermath was complicated. Grace had lost months of income while fighting the charges, and though she was now suing Richard Thornton for damages, such lawsuits took time to resolve. The public sympathy for her situation led to something unexpected: a crowdfunding campaign started by a group of domestic workers' rights activists. Initially modest in its goals, the campaign went viral, raising over $300,000 in just 2 weeks. People from around the world contributed, many leaving messages about their own experiences with injustice or their gratitude for the domestic workers in their own lives. The money meant Grace didn't have to immediately return to work while she was healing, a luxury she had never experienced in her adult life. She used some of the funds to enroll in online courses in social work, beginning to contemplate a future where she might help others navigate systems that had nearly destroyed her. The relationship between Grace and Emma Thornton remained complicated but profoundly important to both of them. With Veronica's permission and Dr. Chen's supervision, they began having supervised visits. The first reunion made Grace weep, holding the little girl, who had saved her life with truth. Emma clung to her, repeatedly apologizing for not speaking sooner, even though Grace assured her that she had nothing to apologize for. These visits became a crucial part of both their healing processes. Grace helped Emma understand that she wasn't responsible for her father's actions, while Emma's presence reminded Grace of the love and purpose that had defined her work. They read books together, as they had before the nightmare began, though now the fairy tales about good triumphing over evil felt more meaningful, more possible. Veronica watched these interactions with a mixture of gratitude and shame, recognizing that Grace had provided more genuine love and protection for Emma than she herself had managed while under Richard's control. Grace also found herself unexpectedly becoming a voice for others in similar situations. Domestic workers' organizations asked her to speak at events and rallies, wanting to use her story to advocate for stronger legal protections and rights. Initially, She was reluctant, uncomfortable with public speaking, and wary of being defined solely by her victimization. But as she met others who had faced false accusations, wage theft, deportation threats, and abuse, she found purpose in advocacy. She began speaking about the need for legal reforms, for due process protections, for consequences when wealthy employers abuse their power. Her quiet dignity and evident sincerity made her a compelling spokesperson, someone who had lived the issues she discussed. As Grace slowly rebuilt her life, she carried both scars and strength, understanding that survival wasn't just about enduring but about transforming pain into purpose, about ensuring that her suffering might prevent someone else's. 6 months after Emma's stunning courtroom revelation, Richard Thornton's criminal trial began amid unprecedented media attention. The charges were extensive: child abuse, perjury, filing a false police report, witness tampering, and obstruction of justice. Additional federal charges related to his business practices were pending, but prosecutors had decided to proceed with the abuse and false accusation charges first, wanting to ensure justice for Grace and Emma before addressing financial crimes. Richard had been denied bail after prosecutors successfully argued he was both a flight risk and a danger to witnesses, particularly his daughter. The months in jail had visibly diminished him. The confident billionaire who had strode into court to destroy Grace Washington now appeared haggard and smaller somehow, his expensive suits unable to restore the aura of invincibility he had once projected. His new legal team, his third since the original charges, worked with limited resources compared to what Richard had been accustomed to deploying. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Linda Chun, the prosecutor who had originally charged Grace, had requested to be part of the team trying Richard, wanting to correct the injustice she had unwittingly facilitated. She presented the jury with a timeline of events supported by phone records, security footage, and witness testimony that systematically dismantled every aspect of Richard's original accusations. Medical experts testified about the nature of Emma's injuries and when they likely occurred, with testimony consistent with Emma's account and impossible to reconcile with Richard's claims about Grace. The jury watched security footage from the Thornton mansion that showed Grace arriving home from grocery shopping after the time Richard had claimed the abuse occurred. Forensic analysis of Richard's phone revealed he had called his attorney 17 minutes before calling 911, a fact that strongly suggested premeditation rather than the immediate protective response of a panicked father. The defense's strategy was to paint Richard as a man who had made a terrible mistake in a moment of stress, who had genuinely believed Grace was responsible for Emma's injuries due to his own confused mental state. They presented testimony from a psychiatrist who claimed Richard had been suffering from stress-induced dissociative episodes, a diagnosis that seemed conveniently timed and was thoroughly demolished on cross-examination. Character witnesses attempted to describe Richard as a devoted father and philanthropist whose actions were inexplicable and out of character, but prosecutors countered with former employees who described a pattern of bullying, intimidation, and explosive anger that contradicted the carefully cultivated public image. The weakest moment for the defense came when they tried to suggest that perhaps Emma had been confused or manipulated into changing her story, a line of argument that Judge Hamilton shut down swiftly and that clearly offended the jury. The most powerful moment of the trial came when Emma testified. Now 8 years old and having spent months in therapy, she took the stand with remarkable composure. The courtroom had been cleared of media and most spectators, with only the necessary legal personnel and Emma's support team present. Her testimony was brief, but unshakable. She described the day her father hurt her, the fear she felt, the way Grace had comforted her, and the terror of being forced to stay silent while an innocent woman faced prison. When Richard's attorney attempted cross-examination, asking if she might have been confused or mistaken, Emma looked directly at her father and said simply, "I know what happened. Daddy hurt me, and then he blamed Grace. I was scared of him, but I'm not anymore." The certainty in her voice, the lack of hesitation or rehearsal, was more damning than any forensic evidence could be. Richard, who had maintained a facade of wounded innocence throughout the trial, finally broke, dropping his head into his hands as his daughter's words destroyed his last defense. Grace Washington attended every day of the trial, sitting quietly in the gallery and watching justice slowly unfold. She felt no joy in watching Richard's destruction, only a profound sadness that so much suffering had been caused by one man's inability to control his anger and accept responsibility for his actions. When the jury returned after only 3 hours of deliberation with guilty verdicts on all counts, Grace closed her eyes and took a deep breath, feeling a weight she had carried for nearly a year finally lift. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, but the convictions themselves represented vindication in a way the dismissed charges against her hadn't quite achieved. As she left the courthouse that day, Grace stopped to speak briefly with reporters, saying only, "Truth doesn't always win quickly, but it won today. I hope everyone remembers that our justice system only works when we protect those who tell the truth, no matter how young they are or how powerful the person they're standing up to might be." The sentencing of Richard Thornton drew another media circus, though the outcome was never really in doubt. Judge Hamilton, given wide latitude by the severity of the crimes and Richard's complete lack of remorse throughout the proceedings, sentenced him to 15 years in state prison followed by 3 years of supervised release. The federal charges related to his business practices were still pending and would likely add additional time to his incarceration. As Richard was led from the courtroom, he finally looked at the gallery where Veronica and Emma sat. Emma met his eyes without fear, and Veronica turned away, her hand protectively on their daughter's shoulder. It was a final severing of the family unit Richard had destroyed through his own actions. For Grace Washington, watching from her usual seat, the sentence brought a sense of closure, though she understood that healing was a process that would continue long after the legal proceedings ended. With the criminal trial concluded, Grace's civil lawsuit against Richard moved forward with renewed momentum. Marcus Freeman, still representing her, had assembled an impressive damages case. Beyond the obvious costs of legal defense, lost wages, and emotional distress, they documented the broader impact on Grace's life. Her inability to work in her chosen field, the ongoing therapy costs, the damage to her reputation that existed despite her vindication, and the loss of the future she had planned before Richard's false accusations destroyed her stability. Expert witnesses testified about the lifetime earning potential Grace had lost and the psychological trauma that would require ongoing treatment. Richard's attorneys attempted to negotiate a settlement, but Grace insisted on a trial, wanting a public accounting of the full cost of what Richard had done. The jury awarded her $12 million in compensatory and punitive damages, a sum that, even after attorney fees and taxes, would transform her financial situation and ensure her security for life. The money was meaningful, but Grace found deeper satisfaction in the changes her case inspired. The state legislature passed the Domestic Workers Protection Act, colloquially known as Grace's Law, which created new legal protections for household employees and established harsh penalties for false accusations. The law mandated that all allegations of abuse by domestic workers be investigated with the same thoroughness as any other criminal accusation, specifically prohibiting the kind of cursory investigation that had initially accepted Richard's word without proper verification. It also created a victims' compensation fund for domestic workers who faced false accusations, ensuring they wouldn't have to face years of legal battles without resources. Grace was invited to the governor's office for the bill signing, and though she was nervous about the ceremony, she attended because she understood the symbolic importance of her presence. Emma Thornton's healing journey continued with Dr. Chen's guidance. The little girl showed remarkable resilience, though she still struggled with nightmares and anxiety about her father. Veronica had moved them from the mansion to a smaller but comfortable home, wanting to create new memories untainted by Richard's presence. The divorce had been finalized with Veronica receiving substantial assets, including full ownership of properties that would secure Emma's future. Mother and daughter were learning to be a family again, building trust that had been eroded by years of living in fear of Richard's temper. Grace remained a regular presence in their lives, continuing weekly visits that were no longer supervised. These visits were precious to all three women, representing the survival and eventual flourishing of relationships that Richard had tried to destroy. Grace herself began working part-time at a domestic workers' rights organization, using her experience to help others navigate legal challenges and workplace disputes. She found the work meaningful in ways that private household employment had never quite been, despite her genuine affection for the children she had cared for over the years. She completed her degree in social work through online and evening classes, preparing for a future career in advocacy. She also started speaking at law schools and police academies about her case, helping train future attorneys and officers to recognize the power dynamics that could lead to injustice. Her story became a teaching tool, a reminder that wealth could corrupt the justice system, but that truth, courage, and persistence could ultimately prevail. As the second anniversary of her ordeal approached, Grace reflected on how completely her life had changed, how she had been transformed from victim to survivor to advocate, carrying scars but also strength she hadn't known she possessed. 3 years after Emma's brave declaration in court, the ripples of the Thornton case continued to spread through multiple systems and countless lives. Richard Thornton was serving his sentence in a medium-security state prison, his appeals exhausted and his former empire completely dismantled. His real estate holdings had been liquidated to pay civil judgments and legal fees, his name removed from the buildings and charitable foundations he had once used to burnish his public image. Fellow inmates knew his story, and the man who had once commanded boardrooms with intimidation now walked prison yards with his eyes down, learning what it meant to be powerless. He had written letters to Emma, attempting apologies that his daughter, now 11 years old and thriving, chose not to read. Dr. Chin advised that Emma would decide in her own time if and when she wanted any contact with her father, and for now, that answer was a firm no. Richard's legacy had become a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of unchecked power and the ultimate price of believing oneself above accountability. Grace Washington had fully embraced her new life as an advocate and social worker. She had opened a nonprofit organization called Truth and Dignity that provided legal support, counseling, and emergency financial assistance to domestic workers facing exploitation or false accusations. The organization, funded initially by her settlement money and subsequently by donations from supporters around the country, had already helped hundreds of workers navigate situations that might otherwise have destroyed their lives. Grace hired other survivors to staff the organization, creating a team that understood intimately the challenges their clients faced. She had become a sought-after speaker, traveling to conferences and universities to discuss domestic workers' rights, racial justice, and the importance of believing victims regardless of their social status. Her quiet strength and refusal to be defined solely by her victimization made her a powerful voice in conversations about reforming systems that too often protected the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Emma Thornton had grown into a remarkably thoughtful young woman, her early trauma channeled into a passionate commitment to standing up for others. With Veronica's support and Grace's mentorship, she had started a peer counseling program at her school for students dealing with family violence, using her own story to help others understand they weren't alone. She wrote an essay about her experience for a national youth writing competition that won first place and was published in major newspapers, reaching millions of readers with her message about the importance of truth-telling even when it's terrifying. Emma spoke at the annual gala for Grace's organization, describing how Grace's love and care had given her a safe person to trust, and how that relationship had ultimately given her the courage to speak up. The bond between Emma and Grace remained central to both their lives, a chosen family relationship that had survived the worst kind of test and emerged stronger. The legal and social reforms inspired by the case extended far beyond the initial legislation. Police departments across the country revised their protocols for investigating accusations involving domestic workers, implementing requirements for thorough, unbiased investigations regardless of the accuser's wealth or status. Bar associations created new ethics training focused on the Thornton case, examining how attorneys should handle situations where they suspect their clients may be lying and what obligations lawyers have to prevent the justice system from being weaponized. Law schools taught the case as an example of how systemic biases could nearly cause a catastrophic miscarriage of justice and what safeguards were necessary to prevent similar situations. The domestic workers' rights movement, energized by the national attention the case had generated, successfully pushed for additional reforms including mandatory written contracts, guaranteed sick leave, and protection from retaliatory deportation reports. Marcus Freeman, the young public defender whose career had been transformed by the case, had founded his own law firm specializing in civil rights and wrongful accusation cases. He maintained a pro bono practice representing domestic workers and other vulnerable clients, ensuring his success didn't distance him from the communities he was committed to serving. He remained close with Grace, who served on the advisory board of his firm's charitable foundation. Together, they had created a fellowship program that funded law students interested in public interest work, hoping to inspire a new generation of attorneys committed to justice over profit. Marcus often reflected that the Thornton case had given him purpose beyond winning arguments. It had shown him what the law could accomplish when wielded by people who truly believed in justice for everyone, not just those who could afford the best representation. As the 5th anniversary of the case approached, Grace stood before a crowd at a domestic workers' rights conference, preparing to deliver the keynote address. She looked out at hundreds of faces, workers, advocates, attorneys, and academics, all gathered to continue the work of building a more just system. She thought about the terrified woman she had been 5 years ago, arrested in the mansion where she had lovingly cared for a child, facing prison for a crime she didn't commit. She thought about Emma's small, brave voice cutting through the courtroom's chaos with simple truth. She thought about the long road from victim to survivor to advocate, and about the countless others who had traveled similar roads or were just beginning their journeys. As she began to speak, Grace's voice was steady and strong, carrying the hard-won wisdom of someone who had faced injustice and emerged not broken but transformed, committed to ensuring that truth, dignity, and justice were not privileges reserved for the wealthy, but rights belonging to everyone, regardless of their station in life. Her story had become larger than herself, a testament to the power of courage, the possibility of redemption through truth, and the importance of systems that protected the vulnerable rather than enabling the powerful. The case that had nearly destroyed her had instead become her platform to help rebuild a more equitable world, one voice, one story, one act of justice at a time.